You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview LaDonna Humphrey. LaDonna, who is from Arkansas, is a private investigator, investigative journalist, and true crime author. LaDonna is the author of the true crime book The Girl I Never Knew, which is about the Melissa Witt unsolved murder case, and LaDonna co-wrote the book Strangled with Alecia Lockhart. I'm here with LaDonna Humphrey. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did.
Who is a true crime author, author of The Girl I Never Knew, and co-wrote Strangled with Alecia Lockhart. LaDonna, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
So much for having me today.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, sure. My name, like you said, is LaDonna Humphrey. I'm an author, a private investigator, and also a nonprofit executive in Northwest Arkansas. And I'm also the mom of 7 kiddos, if you can believe that, all with a passion to, be in this true crime genre. My case that I work on is that of the unsolved murder of Melissa Witt. She was murdered in 1995 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and that's really kind of the premise on which my work is done.
Now, this is a question I actually had in the middle of my list, but since you mentioned the Melissa Witt case, how did you become involved in that, and do you work alongside law enforcement in the Melissa Witt case?
So, the short answer to that is I'd been a part of another nonprofit. That nonprofit was actually closing its doors. Our services were no longer needed. We wanted to wrap up all the good work we'd done for almost 2 decades with a documentary. We initially thought that the documentary was going to be on the plight of missing adults, but as fate would have it, I often say, our nonprofit board wanted us to look at the case of Melissa Witt. That's, basically in our own backyard. It's about an hour away from where we're located. And so I initially got involved with investigators on the premise of the documentary. And after working with them, for weeks and then months, and then it turned into a year, our relationship just really sort of cinched, and they saw some value in the work that we were doing in terms of the social media campaigns, the interviews that we were doing, the new leads that we were kicking up. And so we've essentially been working together ever since. I work very closely with 2 retired investigators on the case, and then I've worked with all of the new detectives that have come along over the past 8 years that I've been involved on Melissa's case.
Now, without spoiling too much of The Girl I Never Knew, what is that about?
Essentially, I wrote that book. It's about the murder of Melissa Witt, but it's like a parallel tale, I think is the best way to describe it, of my journey in the case, my efforts in the case to help bring closure, and I sort of weave that story in with details about her case and interviews that I've done and experiences that I've had over the past 8 years as I've worked to investigate her murder.
Now, you also co-wrote Strangled with Alecia Lockhart. Without spoiling too much of that book, what is that about, and what is it like to work with Alecia on writing Strangled?
So Strangled, the premise of that book is a very specific tip that came in on the Witt case. That tip was actually called in by Alecia Lockhart, and just through getting to know her, investigating that tip, she and I started on this journey, and we really delved into a very dark community on the internet that glorifies the murder of women. And through that journey, we wrote the book, and then we also launched a podcast together. And working with her has been very amazing. She's very passionate and dedicated. She's an advocate for women's safety, and she's also very passionate about the Melissa Witt case. So it's been an amazing journey, and one that I'm very proud of. I'm very proud to work with Alecia.
Now, the Girl I Never Knew, and I believe Strangled as well, were both published by Genius Book Publishing. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, is Genius a traditional book publisher, an imprint of a larger traditional publisher, or an independent press?
They are just a traditional publisher.
So one of the smaller, not a big five.
It's a small but mighty is what I like to say.
Now, do you plan on writing more books in the future?
I do. I'm actually contracted with Genius for 4 more books. 2 will come out this year, and then 2 will come out in 2024. So yeah, I'm still going to have a close relationship with them. It's been, I think, good for both of us, and I hope to continue to work with them in the future.
Now, did you become a private investigator before the Melissa Witt murder, and if so, how did you become a private investigator?
I became a private investigator because of my work on the Witt case. I was working so closely with retired investigators and with law enforcement that we all began to see some value in perhaps me getting my PI license. So I partnered up with a PI here in Arkansas so I could basically, learn the ropes, and she sponsored me to be able to go and take my test, and fortunately I was able to pass that exam. It was really tough. It's been something that's been one of the highlights of my life. I'm very proud of that accomplishment, and I use that PI license predominantly for the Witt case, but I also do other kinds of investigations with that as well. So it's been an interesting chapter. It's something that I highly recommend to those that are doing deep dives into cases and maybe want to branch out and do that for a living. I think that there's a lot of value in having that license and all the things that come with that.
Okay, we've discussed your work as an author, a private investigator, a nonprofit executive. Tell us more about your work as an investigative journalist.
So, predominantly that work has been done in 2 fields. One is all the work that I've done on the Witt case, but I'm also very involved in missing persons cases throughout our state, the state of Arkansas, but also throughout the nation. I've been involved in writing all kinds, from magazine articles, newsletter articles, things for our own website for about 2 decades. And, my passion is to be able to help these families that have these unresolved crimes that are out there. Having a loved one that is missing and this ambiguous loss is one of the worst experiences that people can go through. So I try to dive in with the cases that I take and do as much investigation and interviewing that I can. Nothing that would jeopardize a case, obviously, but just enough that I can share very critical information with the public in hopes of propelling that case forward, or making the phones ring at the local PD so they can take a new tip or maybe new information that they haven't had before. So that's predominantly how I've spent my life for the past 2 decades in terms of all of my investigative journalism work.
Now, before I ask the final question, I'm going to make a passing mention of a missing persons case that got resolved when I was younger in my home county here in Illinois, Vermilion County, Illinois. Back around 2000 or so, a teenage male by the name of Ryan Ketcher, I believe his name was, went missing for several years, and he was eventually found dead, and in his vehicle at the bottom of a pond that I had fished at prior to his discovery, believe it or not.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, his car was so far down the bottom of the pond, nobody saw it for 8 years, and there wasn't really any evidence of a vehicle going a drift, like skid marks or vegetation run over, anything like that. So that's why he was missing for so long, and a lot of people in this area were worried that he might have been murdered when it wasn't
wow.
actually the case.
Okay. Yeah, those are hard cases, I think, because you've got the what if, and then when you finally find out, it was like, I don't know. I think sometimes it makes it even more heartbreaking that you weren't able to find that person sooner. So I'm sorry to hear about that case.
Yeah, and my final question is, you host a podcast called the Deep Dark Secrets Podcast. What type of content can be found on a typical episode of your podcast?
So, our first season that we're in the middle of right now, we are covering our investigation into the death fantasy community online, which was basically something that I touched on earlier. It's these communities of primarily men online who glorify the murder of young women, and so right now we have our episodes are 11 months long. Every week we dive into either a death fantasy murder. We talk about legislative efforts that we are orchestrating throughout the United States, but it's all based on the death fantasy community and our work there, our investigative work.
That is disturbing to find so many, mostly men, who fetishize over the deaths of people.
Oh, it's horrifying. It's been a very, very horrifying experience for us because through the course of our investigative work and then our podcast, where we're exposing the producers of these movies, because they make movies, they have artwork, well, they call it art, all sorts of things that glorify murder. We've been doxxed. We've had our lives threatened. It's been quite a roller coaster. But it's work that Alecia and I are very passionate about, and work that we're not willing to stop. We believe that these communities do not fall within free speech because they are glorifying murder, and a lot of these forums that are online, they actually lead to real life murder, and that's what we discuss on our podcast. And so it is our goal to help eradicate these communities online.
Well, LaDonna, that was my final question, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and you were a fantastic guest.
Well, thank you. I am very pleased to be here. I hope you'll share this link with me so I can share it on my social media pages, just so people can learn about your podcast, and I can share this interview.
I'm going to conclude this episode on a personal note. After I interviewed LaDonna, but before I completed production of this episode, there was a medical emergency in my family. On the Saturday evening immediately prior to the uploading of this episode, my mother had to be hospitalized due to an extreme urinary tract infection that was so severe she couldn't get out of bed on her own. As of Monday, my mom is still hospitalized, but she is recovering and beginning physical and operational therapy, and I hope she can get well enough to come home. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.